So this afternoon we're basically going to be stepping back in time to the year 1912. Blackwell is quickly approaching its 20th anniversary. A rudimentary 9-hole course has been in play since the club's inception, and it's fair to assume that things are looking pretty rosy.
So today we've just been out there, a small mob of us geeks have been on Blackwell, walking around what we believe to be the original 9-hole Harry Colt course, pre-Tom Simpson. So 1912 Harry Colt 9-hole course. We should give full credit to Simon Haines, who's been beavering away on his own.
I'm a member at nearby Copteith Golf Club and somewhat of a Harry Colt geek for my sins. Joined by Joe McDonnell, and Joe is a member here as well as at Hoylake, and I think would consider himself an equal Harry Colt geek. So we'll be your hosts today.
But he's been beavering away and found some real golden nuggets of info. We've both been passionately interested in Blackwell for a long time because it has this unbelievable pedigree. We both appreciate how great the routing is over such a small portion of land, parcel of land. You know, it's 100 odd acres and manages to make such good use of the land. Fantastic 18 holes, constant variety, brilliant use of the landforms, and never feels like you're playing sort of consecutive holes back and forth, changes direction, lots of variety, just a brilliant course. But I think Simon knew for sure that Harry Colt had been responsible for holes before Tom Simpson eventually was brought in to design the 18.
I was aware through my research of Colt's involvement at my home club of Copteith that he was working in the sort of South Birmingham area around the time of his arguably most productive period of his career, which was 1912, 1913, 1914, just prior to the outbreak of the First World War. So I had an article that detailed the original routing and then the Colt routing, but we only had the yardages of, I think, 4 holes. So then, as that sort of spread, we went and did some ordnance survey work to figure out how much of the current property the club actually had at that point. One of the really big missing pieces of the jigsaw that we didn't have until we went scouring through the attic in the clubhouse was a 1950s pamphlet the club produced, which actually had all the whole yardages in. And that really started to cement the routing options, because there's only so many options you could get the actual yardages fitted into the property.
Essential supplies here.
Oh no, that's very important.
We won't put the
Wait,
additional gift
thank you.
because it will make you look like an alcoholic.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Well, it is Blackwell.
Double parked, yeah. Welcome to the first tee of the Harry Colt routing here at Blackwell. So in 1912, Harry Colt was starting to somewhat take the mickey alongside his day job as the secretary at Sunningdale by working pretty much full-time as a golf course architect. In those times, there wasn't such a thing as a role as a golf course architect, and Colt was the first to really turn it into something that was a profession. Prior to that, there was generally gentlemen who tended not to have to work, trying their hand at design, and then it was the professionals, so the likes of Varden and Taylor, who were the most prominent guys designing golf courses in those days. So in 1912, Colt was in the area. He was working at Copteith at that time, and the Copteith course, largely as we know it today, opened for play in the summer of 1913. So the Colt routing here was under construction in November 1913, so winter afterwards, but Colt was back and forth at Copteith for that period of time. We didn't actually finish the full 18 holes at Copteith until 1914, just prior to the First World War outbreak. In March of 1913, Colt resigned his post as the secretary at Sunningdale. I think feeling a little bit guilty about the amount of time he was actually spent not there. And in April, so a month after that, he did his second trip over to the United States, during which he designed Pine Valley. So the time he was working here was very much the peak of his powers. He was also working at Camberley Heath and St George's Hill at exactly the same time that he would have been overseeing work and implementing the holes here. So you've kind of got a bit of history of arguably the greatest architect at the very peak of his powers here that has largely been hidden from view. I've been aware of Colt's involvement in the local area for quite a few years, but didn't really have anything other than the passing comment of Colt's involvement at Blackwell through a sentence in their club history book. So the real thing that really kicked this off was I've got quite a big digital archive of historic golf course imagery, and I had what turns out to be a mislabeled photo of the 18th green at Blackwell, dated 1920, and 1920 would have put it before Simpson's design, and I knew that Colt had done some work there, and I thought maybe this is actually a photo of Colt's work on the 18th green. As it turns out, the club didn't have the land the 18th green, the current 18th green is built on, until sort of 1922, late 1921. So it definitely wasn't. It was a mislabeling in my archive. But actually, that's what prompted the investigation, and from there, very quickly snowballed. And I went to my partner in crime and in these sort of architectural archaeology projects, Joe, and down the rabbit hole we went.
There was some uncertainty about just exactly what Colt had done. You know, what were these preceding holes? In the early days of Blackwell, the very first course that was here, we're still slightly unsure as to what that course looked like, but stories tell us that there were some crisscrossing holes, there was some slightly uneconomical use of land. But what we do know is then that Colt was brought in to improve this and make a more coherent 9 holes, and of course Harry Colt, being Harry Colt, produced what we believe to be a very, very good coherent routing of 9 holes. So we did our digging away. We've got archive material that, as I say, Simon has been looking through the libraries, you know, finding everything he could, putting the pieces together. And then there were a few pieces that it was light bulb moment, that was it, you know, we're certain of some things.
So I think we had a pretty good stab. I reckon we got to sort of 70% of where we ended up by piecing bits together. So I had an article that detailed the original routing and then the Colt routing, but we only had the yardages of, I think, 4 holes. So then, as that sort of spread, we went and did some ordnance survey work to figure out how much of the current property the club actually had at that point. That became a bit easier because actually we were building out of the boundaries of what the club had, and that forced us into fewer options in terms of some of the whole yardages. And then I guess to where we are today, the final bit, having also walked it on the ground and seen some of the shaping that left some pretty obvious telltales, was I managed to find an article that described the Simpson course. So what was really interesting for me is a similar story with the Sunningdale new course development, which he was the club really, and within the first 10 years of the construction of the new course, Tom Simpson was brought in to reroute the new course around the turn. The members considered the holes to have too much hill walking, and Simpson was brought in. And I think about the politics involved with ousting the stalwart and former employee of the club to bring in a big architectural rival at the time was fascinating. And there's a similar story here with Blackwell, where Colt had done 9 holes. At the time, the club wanted to do 18, but they didn't have the land. And then when they got the land, I believe they interviewed both Colt and Simpson. Colt was considered too expensive, so they brought Simpson in. And I've got a really good article where Simpson takes a journalist, it's actually, I think it's Charles Ambrose actually, so a very reputable golfing journalist, an artist, took him round his new design and was very much talking about the course as his design. No mention of Fowler at all, which leads me to believe this was absolutely from the hand of Tom Simpson. But the thought process involved with ousting Colt and going with his big rival, I found that really interesting, in a similar vein as the work at Sunningdale New. It then makes you realise that actually reusing some of the greens as they've done, so I think our research indicates 5 of the greens are being reused from the Colt design, makes perfect sense. So why would you go through the big expense of rebuilding greens and bunkers when you could alter the routing but save a lot of expense and reuse what you can. So then all those bits started to come together. We then spent quite a bit of time walking the property, which is hard to visualize some of the things where you can't quite see with mind's eye when you've got trees, or you can't see from a flat aerial image. But when you're on the ground, as we found today, when you walk the first hole, which makes no sense if you're describing it to somebody in the bar, but when you're on the ground, it comes to life and makes perfect sense.
We've been measuring, we've used modern tools. We've got things like Google Earth and mapping and GIS, which enables us to accurately take yardages. We've got LiDAR data, so you can see the landforms in the hillshade. You can see footprints of old bunkers that have been lost, perhaps green sites that you can still see sitting in the land there. And now with some recent tree clearances by Ben here, Ben Lovett, that we can actually start to see old playing corridors which might not have been visible before because of overgrowth and such. But we've been here with a group of enthusiastic members who very kindly come out and shown interest in our research, and we've been out there walking what we believe to be the 9 holes of Colt.
We're pretty confident, we're like 95% confident, I would say, that our routing now, with the exception of a couple of green sites that aren't that obvious in the ground, we're pretty confident that what we've got now on paper is what Colt put here in 1912-13. Then you get the benefit if you can hit it long enough to get it down a bit of a speed slot down.
So the first hole would have played from what is today's 9th tee, right into the corner of the property, right by today's entrance to the driveway entrance. The old clubhouse, the pavilion, was down very near to where today's gatehouse is by the front gate. That would have been the first tee and the final green, so the final green would have been today's 8th green. And your first hole was a good, sturdy 3-shotter, and it took you away from that corner of the property, straight back down today's 8th fairway, and then actually across to today's 15th green. And that would have been a 500-yard hole. And when we were first looking at it, we thought, okay, 500 yards, it's a long hole for those days. Can it work? There's a lot of camber in that land left to right. Could it actually function? And when you get up there and you start walking through the trees, which clearly wouldn't have been there 115 years ago, you look at as the 15th green appears, and you think, oh, of course, it works perfectly. The land sweeps away to the right side. The green's long axis is straight down as you approach it from today's 9th tee. And you realise actually this is a perfect 3-shot hole and the perfect green for that. Because the further right you played and the more you bailed away from the camber of the hill, the more you're coming in and across the short axis of the green and taking on the guarding bunkers around that right side. And we know today, as you play the 15th hole, you drive and then you play up to this shallow green, which is an absolute nightmare at today's green speeds. Fantastic fun. But back in the day, that first hole and that first green are really coherent. They work perfectly. And of course, with being Colt, he wanted you to get away efficiently and quickly and not bottleneck straight off that first tee. So it worked very well. It was a real sort of bogey 5, or in this particular case, a proper 5, 3-shotter. Followed by a second hole from the back of today's 15th, from a tee set into the hill. Of course, all the trees weren't there. Playing right down 14 into a green which was set. You can actually see some of the old bunker footprints if you know what you're looking for.
So I think in all likelihood, this was the green pad here. That was a front bunker. And where the bunker is there was probably, I would imagine, bunkers there as well, knowing how Colt would bunker a short par 4. So it would have been probably quite a small, quite a treacherous green, especially when you think about the hole we're about to play next, which clearly the remnants of a small treacherous green are not here, so they would probably have been flattened because this is an area of play from the Simpson changes, but they've left that shape. I would imagine that was the front of the green, given that we're playing down the hill.
I personally think my favourite hole of the routing that we found is Colt's third hole. And we know for sure, another article confirms, probably the same writer, talks about the old third green, which has now been repurposed into today's 13th green. Arguably the influence of Bobby Jones on the golden bell of Augusta's 12th. But this was my favourite, I think, in the old holes. A beautiful sort of medium length par 4 for those days, 200, nearly 300 yards, but you were teeing off near to today's house in that corner of the property, and you were hugging the property boundary. Of course, no trees to be seen on that right side. The road was very much in play, of course, probably quite quiet in those days, didn't have lots of motor cars coming up and down and such, it would be horse and cart. But yeah, you were challenged to hug the right side with the out of bounds on that right, but also you were allowed to play way out left if you wanted to with your drive. Let's say you hit a good drive of 200 yards with your old hickory clubs, and then you knew what you were facing. The further left you went, the longer your approach in across the short axis of the green, which had the lovely brook running straight across it in a diagonal fashion, and bunkers beyond. So the green was, you can see now as you look back at it, you think it's perfect for that angle. Not to say today's hole isn't fantastic, because it is, in a different way altogether, playing from the raised teeing ground down to a very broad green, horizontally speaking. But when you look at it the way we have done today and walked it, you realise it, it clicks in your head. You think, of course. But of course it's crying out to you as you look back down that hole. Brilliant, brilliant hole for the day, perfect length off the tee, real jeopardy outright. But then if you bail away, you're just delaying the inevitable, which is playing across a very, very tricky green and watercourse, and just a great sort of short, medium par 4. So the fourth is another good, sturdy, probably two-shotter, possibly, erring on the side of a bogey 5. But you played from today's existing 14th tee, and again it was brought the property boundary into play. Today very shrouded by trees, but there's actually the watercourse runs right along the right side of the boundary, and there's something of a half-pipe nature to the fairway, which plays as 12 today, and has the snake bunker, of course, famous snake bunker right on the right side of the 12th hole. But if you flip and you look back down the 12th hole, or back up I should say, into the corner, you were playing to a green which was close to the road and on that right side near to the watercourse, and that would have been the extent of the property boundary of those 9 holes, because today's pathway, the footway, bridleway that comes across towards the clubhouse, that would have marked the edge of what was a field and was subsequently purchased by the club and brought into play for this new 18 holes of Simpson. So that was a great hole, really sort of good two-shotter. Again, the more you took on that right side and flirted with OB, the more you had a good look down a green. We don't know for sure what the green looked like, how it was bunkered, but we suspect Colt, being a man of strategy, would have said, well, okay, you can play away from the danger, again, similarly to the previous hole, but the further away you play, probably the more you brought in bunkers which would have guarded the near left side of a green in that corner of the property.
So the 5th hole would have started probably at probably the easiest way of picturing it is at the beginning of the snake bunker on the 12th, and plays to the current first green. So would have been a shortish by today's standards, sort of early 300s yard hole, but the drive would play to the base of a hill and play a blind sort of 130 to 150 yard shot to an elevated green. There was an option to get visibility of the green by laying further back on your tee shot. So the further up you went, the more blind it would go. It's a slightly awkward feeling hole. I guess they were having to deal with going uphill at some point, and that's the way they've done it. Using blindness was not unheard of. It was very common, but very sparingly. So what it did give you, though, is the ability to then play the next hole, which is the 2nd hole that we played today, the 6th in the Colt routing. And I'd always assumed the 2nd hole at Blackwell It's quite an extreme green, wonderful par 3, and I would have probably described it as a classic Simpson hole, and it turns out it's a classic Colt hole because it was the only lift and shift hole on the entire routing. So that hole that we play is the Harry Colt par 3, 6th in that routing, 2nd in today's, which was one of the really interesting points that we found out. Probably alongside that and the 3rd hole that shares the green with the current 13th, they're probably the 2 most interesting facts. Then we get into the part of the course where actually we haven't got the existing, the original greens still on the ground. So we're having to use a bit of imagination. We can piece together with the boundary and also the yardages to understand where they largely were. And you can see some remnants on the ground, but it's not that obvious, and you can't really see the bunkers, albeit you can see some of the undulations in the ground. So you played, having played a hole uphill, you then play a longer hole that plays downhill into the corner of the property, which the longer hitters will have a big advantage because they'll be able to use the downslope off the tee. Then you get to what is probably one of the most British holes, arguably the most British hole actually, the 8th in the old Colt routing, which was from that corner along an out of bounds boundary, which is currently bridle way. So anything right of that would have been out of bounds. And down towards where the current 9th green is. We suspect it wasn't that exact green because that would be sloping away from you into a pond, and already a 420-yard hole would have been quite a beast in just its yardage. But we suspect the green was probably slightly to the left of that existing one. I would say this was probably green edge here. But either way, it would have been a really tough hole with jeopardy all down the right-hand side. The final hole is basically still there today, albeit we're playing to the current 8th green, over the pond, almost back down the length of the existing 9th par 3, but playing back the other way. So the pond doesn't quite go as close to the front of the green as it does when you play it the other way in today's routing. But the hole is largely as it exists today. You could throw a ball down and play that again, albeit there's some trees that in an ideal world wouldn't be there today. You definitely get an appreciation for the work of Colt, using what is probably only 50 acres maybe at a push, and fitting in a lot of golf in 50 acres. Similar story if you look at the Sacred 9 at Royal Wellington, similar sort of acreage, and you've played a lot more golf than just normal 9 holes. There's a lot of variety out there, as there is at Worley. The reuse of greens I think is really interesting, but also makes perfect sense because some of the greens on today's course maintained at today's green speeds are quite extreme. So 13 today, 15 today, 2 today. Those greens have a huge amount of slope in them and ideally should be played up the axis of approach. And for example, the 13th, the par 3 we played today, is played straight across the axis. And with the severity of slope and fast greens, it's really difficult to hold a ball on that putting surface, certainly in the summer. But when you look at it being played from a full 90 degrees to the side, it makes perfect sense. So I think Simpson probably, if he was having to maintain greens at speeds of 10 on the stimp, would have softened some of the greens rather than just straight reusing. But it makes today's golf really interesting, and certainly some of the greens are more extreme than you would probably have found otherwise.